Hello, dear viewers. Welcome to our special roundtable, which we have decided to organize because on the 12th of April in America, the 13th of our time, a video was released on Egon Cholakian's platform, which has brought very interesting information to the situation that is happening in our movement and globally as well. We are going to say more about who Egon Cholakian is. He is a security expert, an intelligence educator. He has worked with 4 former US presidents. He has worked on major projects of US intelligence services, including in the classified Area 51. When we watched his video, frankly, we were shocked. We were shocked by the information that was voiced. But, on the other hand, it began to explain a lot of things. Why we, as volunteers of the organization, were bullied, harassed, had dirt thrown at us, and ultimately, we understood where the wind was blowing from.
Exactly. And we have also understood where all the misinformation comes from, where all the sentiment in society for disintegration comes from. What we have seen already, for example, in the United States, what has happened, the disintegration of the United States, the disintegration of the European Union, where all the pessimism of the population, the distrust of politicians comes from. And today on this platform, we're going to unfold that here.
Well, yes, it's true, because if you take the fact that somewhere around 2006, 2004 or so, when polls were taken, even in Europe, that how many people were in favor of the European Union, those numbers were brutally high. If you would do the same poll now, all of a sudden you would get somewhere below 50%. So what is the reason and why exactly there are voices in America that Texas is leaving the Union, that one is leaving the Union, even voices that there may be a civil war and so on? That is, you're going to learn who's behind all of this and why it's happening.
It was very interesting how he uncovered a certain secret force, a shadow force that is actually infiltrating politics, infiltrating various states, and not only in Europe, but also, as already has been said, in America, which is basically their main goal, what they are after. And the whole thing was very fascinating.
Yes. It's also worth pointing out that the group around Egon Cholakian has been working on this unmasking, on this project for more than 30 years, since 1993. And so they've managed to gather some very interesting and serious information.
In fact, for the last 10 years, they have been intensively unraveling the scheme which is being used, and therefore it has been very helpful in explaining what is really going on, not only in our country, but also in the world. I mean, just to get back to that history, the title of this program that came out is Undeclared War, America is Under Attack. When you first look at it, the first thing that comes to your mind is what kind of attack, because there are no battles fought and so forth, but ultimately it clearly reveals where that war is being waged. That is to say, it is being waged precisely in the field of information and in the field of our minds, what we think, what we accept as facts, and that makes the war all the more dangerous because we do not know how to face it.
Yes, it is not a customary war with weapons. It is really a war of information, with how people perceive their country, structures, and basically what they then want to do.
I was also struck by the question, why Slovakia? After all, who are we? What are we? We are like some tiny little country somewhere in the European Union. And why did they suddenly choose Slovakia to start as some kind of bridgehead of that operation here? I mean, it clearly shows what was stated in the Cholakian's video, that they needed a country that is already a member of the EU to set the scheme for how to get to other Western countries that are in the EU, and it is more convenient for them to do it in a country that is not big. There's a high probability of them succeeding. So this is actually why Slovakia. And moreover, we should probably say, what are we going to call that organization? I would suggest that we stick to what Cholakian said, that we will stick to the term KGB, but we will now explain why. There were several departments within the KGB, and the one department that basically remained unchanged since the 1920s and kept its line without any organizational changes was the department associated with Felix Dzerzhinsky, Gleb Boki, and Barchenko. And when we were digging into the information, we found out also on the internet that actually it was that department, and it was confirmed to us by Cholakian in his video, which dealt with war in human consciousness and subconsciousness, that is influencing the human conscious and subconscious mind. And that explains a lot of the things that are going on here. I mean, they have experience with it, they know how it works.
Cholakian also says there that it was not at all assumed that this organization was still functioning.
Yes.
It was assumed that this organization, or that subsection of the KGB, was actually dismantled with the collapse of the Soviet Union. But obviously, that's not the case, because the practices that they were using basically under the Soviet Union are now in the working.
And on that basis, they actually started this surveillance. Suddenly they detected in the information field practices and a system of work that was typical to that division of the KGB during the Soviet Union.
Yes.
So we actually have two organizations that were waging an active information struggle against each other. That is, one was trying to tear America apart, the other was trying to tear apart the Soviet Union. The one that managed to break the Soviet Union without a single shot won. And the other organization, which therefore had lost its field of operations, sort of its castle, its empire,
took it as a huge defeat.
yes, like vanity, and it leads up to basically them being willing to eliminate anyone who stands in their way in order to carry out their revenge.
Exactly.
To get revenge for the fact that they have lost.
And they do this by very insidious methods, that is, by implementing someone else's thought into the consciousness of the masses. And in this way, they achieve that actually the people themselves, so to speak, disintegrate the society which, today, can be described as democratic. And that is actually their main objective.
Yes, because whatever way you look at it, at the word democracy, we still have freedom here. We still have a certain kind of liberty here. That basically we do not want something like North Korea to emerge here.
Exactly. And yet, even today, we can hear completely contradictory statements from some journalists that freedom of speech and freedom of religion is something that is not natural. We can hear ideas like not all people should be given a space in the media, which actually violates the basic principles of human rights and freedoms. And it is precisely on the basis of these substandard statements that we can identify that this is a work of this organization.
But people cannot even imagine that they could be manipulated in any way. Who would admit it? It is very difficult. But basically, the way the whole situation is developing, even in geopolitics, even the perception of individual states, countries. It is actually as if the results of this influence are only visible in the long term. And that is why it is also so difficult to detect this for other security services, who have it going on right under their noses.
So you have something to look forward to, which we will discuss in this roundtable. So let's move on.
So let's recap. Since 1993, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there has been a certain secret shadow organization, which we have already named the KGB, whose main objective is to subvert democratic regimes and to avenge the destruction of the Soviet Union.
For basically having destroyed the Union right under their noses. Such experts, they take it very personally. They take it as a mockery.
Basically, they have failed to do their job.
They have not fulfilled the task.
They were hired to do it. They were created to do it.
And they missed it. It basically sort of fell apart under their hands without a shot being fired.
What else needs to be said is that the aim of these people at that time was to create a totalitarian world regime, which they would have succeeded if it had not been for the intervention of the US intelligence. It must also be said that these are people who have no homeland, who do not recognize borders, and who operate globally throughout the world.
That is true, and in fact, this is an organization that operates from the shadows, as do all intelligence agencies. That is, as we mentioned earlier, there was a game being played here. The US intelligence agencies versus the intelligence agencies of the Soviet Union. The American intelligence agencies won, and they basically managed to avert what they were already plotting in the mid-80s when they wanted to subvert America. As Egon Cholakian said in his video, that was what initialized, that they actually accelerated the operation and the actions to disrupt the Soviet Union without firing a single shot, because there was a threat that if they didn't, the adversary would succeed in doing so.
Exactly. And consider that these are the people who had the access to the gold reserves of the Soviet Union at that time. They had access to the state budget. That is to say, they were able to secure for many years in advance sufficient resources for themselves to succeed in this plan.
Yes, that's actually the answer to where they get their money from.
Precisely.
Where they get their funding from. How is that possible? Because what they do requires insane funding. But they, as an organization that had access to all the resources in the Soviet Union, it was absolutely no problem for them to secure funding for years in advance.
You still have to remember here that they're not aiming to gain some kind of outright influence over somebody, or they are not fighting for power as such. This is a downright payback thing. They go and destroy. They are subverting democracy in individual countries, whether it's the European Union, whether it's America. Cholakian says it's all just targeting America. He even tells us what it leads to.
Exactly. And you can tell precisely by the practices they use. That is, as we mentioned, they never go into direct open conflict. They always operate from the background and through their so-called front organizations, which we will also discuss today, who they are, what they are. They bring ideas of disruption, of discontent, of division into the minds of the masses, so that people themselves create pressure, so to speak, to overthrow the democratic order.
Or even to start a nuclear war. Just consider that you have a politician who for real will be controlled in this way, who will create fear in society, and consequently, the people themselves will find it necessary to carry out a preventive nuclear attack against their enemy. That is, they are not afraid of starting a nuclear conflict or a nuclear war. That's the unraveling of America is already indicated by this, or these, I should say, actions or initiatives of theirs, that in this year, 2024, the movie Civil War came out in American theaters, where they are actually clearly instilling in people how it can be, how it's going to work, and how they should behave and what narratives to use, and explicitly to unravel society and really to get that war started. I think there was even a date in his video when that's supposed to happen. And that was the year 2028.
Yes, he argued that even in 2024, when the next presidential election is supposed to be, this KGB involvement or influence is minimal. But it's already a preparation of the field for them to actually put in their candidates in 2028. And it's a preparation for civil war.
Well, basically, none of the Americans today can imagine that. That film, that Civil War, is exactly a guide, to get it into the minds of the people so that they then know when the time is right. Actually, well, that's how it's done.
And as absurd as it may seem today, even though we already see that because of political views, families don't talk, there are conflicts there, people go into open conflicts. We can show an example. For example, 10 years ago, if you told the Russians and Ukrainians that they would kill each other, they would have laughed at you. It was considered something completely unacceptable. And today, we see that this is complete reality.
Well, if you had asked an American in the past whether he was for the breakup of the United States or whether some states should secede from the Union or from the United States, secede sort of, he wouldn't have even discussed it with you, because the prevailing sentiment there was that they were Americans first and foremost, and America was great. And now have a look how that narrative has changed. And
they were proud to be Americans. They were proud to be building just a great world, a land of unlimited possibilities, the American dream. Just anybody who wants to, they can just assert themselves. And this was a wonderful vision. And basically today, it's completely different.
yes,
Today, people live in tents like in...
people admit quite openly, sort of like defeatism. They have defeatist sentiments, and that plays right into the scenario that's been set up by the KGB division, which is trying to... Actually, the main goal is to avenge the defeat in 1991.
It is enough just to look at what's happened in Texas recently now. So already the sentiment among the population, where the governor of Texas has already said something to the effect that he doesn't want to actually submit to the federal regime. We're already seeing this narrative in society, and it was beautifully shown on the map which states.
Where there are what sentiments?
Where there are sentiments which are leaning towards Texas and which are actually leaning towards federation. That is to say that while a few years ago it was unimaginable, today we're seeing it live.
People tend to say, well, yes, it was like that then, but then this happened, and then that happened, and that led to like a downturn in the mood.
But nothing happened just like that.
Nothing happened just like that. Exactly. It's just, we can only see it in the long run, right?
There is a consistency to this. What this has actually revealed to us is that nothing just happens by chance, and everything happens for a reason, and somebody is behind it and driving it. And we already know who that is based on Cholakian's video. Yet here, as we were just going through the video, it was actually mentioned that there is a tension building up, such as there actually is in totalitarian systems. So in other words, it says what you said, that they don't have a state, they don't have borders, they don't have anything. So they are aiming for creation of a totalitarian society. And Like I said, I don't want a North Korea here where you are going to walk around and nod and wave and think only what you are told.
Exactly. You know, we live in a democratic system today. If we hear the idea that there are going to be 15-minute cities, that there is going to be a digital currency that can be a tool for repression of the population, and of course, these kind of things stir up a kind of inner dissonance in people. And this is actually the virus that this group, through the media, is putting into people's minds, so that people themselves are, as it were, against this, so to say, democratic system.
And you know, when you talk to people as well, they'll tell you that 15-minute cities are great. You save a lot of time. Yes, but be aware that you limit yourself to a certain location and you're done. You can't go any further. Done. It's a digital concentration camp.
Exactly. And just what Cholakian said, the way these secret forces in the form of KGB work. Exactly reveals the handwriting of this organization. And now it becomes all the information that surrounds us quite clear and understandable.
Do you know what that reminds me of? Do you remember that movie from Marvel, Captain America? This exact thing came to me as I was watching the Cholakian video yesterday. Seriously, the association of Cholakian with Captain America, and actually we the people, the others, as he was addressing us there, with this information that we were the shield, that basically he held it, his shield in the fight against. Also, there was Hydra mentioned, and it was pretty similar. My question is, didn't Marvel know any information? You know, as they say, you've been told everything in the videos and in the movies, etc. Well, we'll see what comes of it. Whether it was so or it was just a coincidence. But in any case, it's interesting.
Certainly, Cholakian is turning to people. So yes, we need to create that shield, Marvelian, one or any other. He's giving us guidance on how to recognize these tactics, what's going on, what to expect, what not to expect. And basically, it's really about how those people are going to perceive it, or what they're going to let themselves be fed, what they're not going to let themselves be fed.
Because seriously, intelligence agencies themselves don't know who is working with who. So that's why he turned to the people, so that we can try to sort out for ourselves what's happening and why it's happening this way. And in the video, the tools are also given. In what way it is recognizable. And also the explanation why it is recognizable in that particular way. I mean, we'll get to that later on. We have it in the notes. Because there's a lot of information, so let's not confuse people. Let's go step by step.
Yes. That's why it's good to know which front organizations they're using to implement those plans, what tactics they're using, and we'll get to that.
As Cholakian explained in the video, actually, the KGB division is using to stay disguised and that no traces would lead to it, so-called the front or cover organizations, that no one would say that it is actually them. The first such organization he mentions is the Russian Orthodox Church, which was a shock to me personally, because, you know, a church organization, lots of believers and so on, you would never have thought in your life that it was their front organization through which they carry out their actions. But it is interesting that one of the prime ministers of the Baltic republics called it a sort of terrorist organization and wanted to have it banned in the European Union. And we'll get there. That's when I saw it. I'm saying, look how everything is starting to fall into place, right? It's not just bubbling, but now when you are going through it, seriously, each and every little puzzle piece falls into place and gives you a particular picture that's been hidden for a long time. And just like a curtain, starts to unfold nicely.
Right. As they say, you know a tree by its fruit.
Exactly. And the other one is, you mentioned it, I think. In that video was that
Anti-cult organizations. These are organizations whose main goal is to consolidate the position of the traditional churches.
it means like the Inquisition,
Let's just say that, yes, it's exactly that.
the modern.
Because in order for them to consolidate the position of the traditional religion, all the other new religious movements, let's say, they already call them sects, but let's say they are new religious movements. They start denigrating them in order to eliminate them. This strikes me as very strange.
That they have so-called a patent on reason, one might say, or on who is not, and so on.
Yes, because most of them are, let's say, experts. They can be religious scholars, studied people. Why not? So basically, it's like they speak nicely. They know well, or they know other religions. They understand the issues, but their main goal is to really denigrate and eliminate new religious movements. And they have, as you say, a patent on reason, that they can say, this is a sect, this is, I don't know, some extremist sect, this is a dangerous one. But basically, like, the funny thing is that they actually create an image of what one imagines a sect to be. Because when I say sect, what do you picture? Certainly nothing positive.
Yeah, that's right.
It's a completely negative thing. And in fact, when you realize that a lot of the mass media sort of refers to or even asks these anti-cult movements uncertain opinion about regarding new religious movements.
So, in other words, basically, I don't know what number of a percentage of what you read in the newspapers, one or another, doesn't matter which one, is from one person.
It's from either one man, or,
And made up the way he made it up.
yeah, or it went through this anti-cult organization.
And do you have any examples of these anti-cult organizations?
The anti-cult ones, they are public. They're public. They're not secret. They work together. They work in an organized way. Even individual people say that they work really professionally together. But when you think about it, the Czech Republic and Slovakia too, as well as a lot of other countries, have these organizations. The main one that is working within Europe is FECRIS. Of course, Russia has its own organization, and you can clearly see the links there. What I find strange, though, is that we actually have organizations that are absolutely legal, whose aim is to smear certain groups, to label them mostly as sects. They don't know anything else, basically. They basically look at it from that religious point of view.
FECRIS is based in Paris, if I'm not mistaken.
And it is also funded.
Which means that the French taxpayer is paying for a quasi-undemocratic organization, I would say, which labels and smears, denigrates even them, if they do not have the right religious view, as I would say.
Well, the right religious view, I wouldn't take it that way, because they're defending the interests of the traditional churches. Take the last X number of years. How many new religions or churches have we had that would be presented in the media as positive? Zero.
Zero.
Because it's as if the newly emerging ones are automatically pandered to and are automatically vilified right from the start.
Don't they also have some sort of proxy or access to the UN, these factories?
They have. There is some direct cooperation. Yes, and there's this thing that, by smearing, they have these very interesting stories, just what the media is looking for. I mean, basically, those media are terribly keen on publishing or referring to them, interviewing them, asking them for their opinion on certain groups. And because it's controversial, very controversial information, it gets published in those media. And these anti-cult movements, not only do they create this opinion, as we've mentioned, I believe 95% of the information you've ever heard about these sects has come from these anti-cult movements. They're working with the media, as we said, but they're also interfering with legislation. They go to lawsuits, which can then lead to bans on these movements. It's pretending to be, well, an anti-cult. Nobody has a clear idea of what it actually is. A harmless organization, but they do some really dirty work.
Egon Cholakian mentioned it in that video, and we think it shows that in reality, those anti-cult movements are sort of a weapon in the field of information warfare. They are there so that nothing points exactly towards the KGB organization. What is more, for a long time, the leader of factories was Dworkin, who is the founder of the Russian variation which you've mentioned, the Russiers. And thus, actually, they're connected.
Absolutely.
So that boggles my mind.
Well, according to what Cholakian says, this organization in Russia, Raciers, that is a Russian association of centers for the study of religions and sects. They act as, you could say, as an advocate for the Russian Orthodox Church. That is to say, it creates a field for the Russian Orthodox Church to be the only acceptable organization, religious organization in Russia.
Okay, but isn't it enshrined in the Russian constitution that you have freedom of religion? They don't have a secular religion, nor a state religion. So it's as if it's being silently pushed.
It's very interesting there, because there's not only one religion in Russia. There are Muslims, there are lots and lots of religions. But even as Cholakian was showing in his video, basically, behind the president of Russia, always present, there's this patriarch of this Orthodox Church of Russia. Nobody else.
On all, one can say official visits. Not on all. On many official visits. But always in that photo, as Cholakian showed those photos, there's always Kirill present.
Yes, but take the helplessness here, because how many letters have been written, how many times have the representatives of other religions approached whether the UN officials or the Foreign Minister Blinken, simply to no avail, nothing has changed. There is still simply one group of people who basically continue in their activities, labeling other movements as sects, and thus creating a monopoly for a certain group that says this is the way it is going to be and that's it. Where is the plurality then? How can such a thing exist in democratic societies where you have freedom of opinion, where you have freedom of religion? How is that simply possible? I can believe whoever I want, and then why am I labeled as this, that, or something else?
They also have tremendous power over these movements because there are plenty of religionists who, when not in any anti-cult movement, it is them who are pointing out what those anti-cult movements are doing, but they're not being heard. They don't say the kind of piffle that the media wants. So actually, they don't get a chance to say it in the media. The anti-cults are just totally connected to those media. And it is a serious violation of human rights. There are lots of references on the internet to how they act, and it is seriously against democracy. It is against human rights.
And they're actually, when we break it down now, they use the same scheme over and over again. That is, first, they falsely accuse somebody. Then they persecute them, and then they ban them. There was such an example, I think, in Russia with the Jehovah's Witnesses.
They have had problems even to this day.
I'm not defending anyone, but I don't think they pose any extreme threats, etc., to anyone. And they were banned in Russia.
But it is interesting. It may not even be a religious organization. They've also gone after companies like Amway, Herbalife, Multilevels, like that. For some reason, this too is a thorn in their side. So they've taken them on, and they're going after them hard.
Well, actually, this labeling brings us to Alatra as well. And also, while it's not a religious movement, that's fine with them. They label us as a religious movement so they can use all their levers they use against religious movements, and people take it. Well, that's the way it is, and that's the way it has to be. And people don't realize at all what's really behind it. And so, as Egon Cholakian said in the video, basically Alatra was like a lamb being led to the slaughter in order for the KGB division, which resumed operations in 1993, to achieve its goals. But on the other hand, their adversary also used Alatra to gain insight into their opponent's activities and the template by which they operate. So we are sort of left between two stones and labeled, one shouting this, the other shouting that. Now it finally makes sense why this was happening.
But what else needs to be said is that the ultimate goal is actually to create so-called totalitarianism, or to bring people into absolute slavery. When we consider what all of this is leading to, these activities, these anti-cult organizations, actually as a facade, so to speak, a cover, or what people see, what it's actually leading to is the restriction of religious freedom, the restriction of the overall freedom of what people can and can't think, victimization, persecution, harsh persecution. All of those are, so to speak, clues that tell us where this is actually going.
All the while we live in democratic societies. We've also further dissected, based on Egon's insights and the information from the video. If you look at the timeline of the discrediting publications against Alatra, we've dissected the scheme that goes, and it actually starts with the defamation. It was initiated by the Russian Orthodox Church. Smear articles, smear campaigns started coming out, and more or less, subsequently, the secular state media picked it up. And even in Ukraine, they started picking up the methodology of the Russian Orthodox Church, two states that stand against each other. But here it didn't matter. Other countries started copying the exact same methodology that they started throwing at Allatra, which was introduced by the Russian Orthodox Church in its original and genuine wording. All journalists who have adopted this rhetoric of lies have adopted the methodology of the Russian Orthodox Church and Rassirs, of which Dvorkin is the founder and leader.
A mentally ill man, by the way.
Yes, that was mentioned there too, that he has specific diagnosis of a mentally ill person. Even a team of doctors said that he should not hold public office. And he got away with it quite easily. And when you consider how much money has been laid out to smear Allatra, you get to $200 million, which may seem like a huge amount. Some will say, well, but still, on a global scale, that's peanuts. Okay. $200 million is 20 ballistic missiles of a certain range. They may win you a battle, but they won't win you a war. The $200 million provided them with an acquisition of an agency network as vast as they could never have dreamed of. That is money very well spent.
They have nothing to be ashamed of.
That's right. Planning worthy of an intelligence agency.
And what's this all about? Revenge of a few old men.
Yes. Offended, vain old men who can't accept the fact that someone else ran them over and beat them.
That's right. And the most terrible thing is that this does not only concern Russia or democratic countries, but also directly affects the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And we could say something about that too.
Well, let's do it. So let's take Slovakia in more detail since we live here.
So far, we've talked about how it works in Russia, how it works in the United States, how these organizations work. And we see exactly the same pattern that we've described also in what's happening in Slovakia. So we could go and talk about that.
Well, as Egon Cholakian spoke about that pattern that was going on in Russia, that is, first there was a smear, then the state representative raised concerns, then the security forces got involved, and then there was a trial. Exactly the same pattern took place in Ukraine, in the exact same way. First, there was a smear in the media, where they started labeling, just changing narratives, and then the member of Verkhovna Rada said that she had some concerns and so on, exactly the same narrative. Law enforcement agencies, power forces and so on got involved, and we are beginning to see the exact same narrative here in Slovakia, where the vilification has begun in exactly the same way. But before we go into that, I would like to mention why it was important, that consistency, why it was Russia, where it started, why did it then go to Ukraine, and why to Slovakia? Why wasn't the consistency the other way around or different somehow? Well, because more or less, they needed to get into the European Union or into the democratic Western states. And it won't get there directly from Russia, because historically there were already some frictions and disagreements or different views I mean, Ukraine was already important enough for the fact that it created sort of a link of how to get to the European Union, to a country in the European Union. And thus, it was very important not to fail there. That's why they used far harsher methods than in Russia. They could not use the narrative of the Russian Orthodox Church and these organizations, and so a narrative of the article from the Ukrainian constitution about high treason was used, because there is a war conflict going on, and therefore, if we look at the fact that most European countries, or the whole Western democratic world, has sided with Ukraine, it was used to transfer the rhetoric right here to us. That is to say, that consistency goes and has already been transferred to the European Union. And since the Czech Republic and Slovakia are the closest and the most interconnected when it comes to this Ukrainian crisis, we can see that it has started here. And you've mentioned, Tomáš, one of the reporters who more or less started it.
It started with, or the first defamatory article I've noticed in the media, the Seznam News. That is the reporter, Mr. Gavrinov, who, in a classic pattern, refers to basically everybody. Among other people, he refers Mr. Vojtěsek, who, as we said, is part of the anti-cult movement. This Mr. Vojtěsek is regarded as an authority of sorts in this area in general. Exactly as we described with those anti-cult movements. It's absolutely the same pattern. If you take the fact that you have a member or a preacher in some church, in his case, the Church of the Brethren, and he has a degree in religious studies from some theological faculty, so he becomes an expert, and I would expect such an expert to be unbiased, to be objective, to compare those movements, to be interested in them, to want to understand them, to know the differences. But that's not the case there. Simply this religionist is biased because he is a member and a preacher of the church. That, to me, is already an obvious clash of interests. And in addition to those two things, he founded the anti-cult movement, or the Society for the Study of Sects and New Religious Movements, which, of course, wherever something, a movement, comes up, it immediately gets a label: sect, totalitarian sect, extremist sect, whatever. For me, the overwhelming question mark was why Alatra was associated with this at all. But he began to talk about us, to show how he really creates that opinion, how much of an authority he is. I'll tell you that such a major news portal in the Czech Republic, or one of the major ones, as is idnes.cz, has 46 articles that take him as a reference. So, in fact, Mr. Gavrinov absolutely, logically, of course, refers to him as well. Well, again, the language used by Mr. Vojtěsek is not completely straightforward because he, as the head of the department, cannot say some things in a straightforward way. But those articles and statements use such a hidden language that in a way one gets an absolutely negative image from it, denigrating.
And that's exactly the handwriting of the intelligence agencies, which means that even the reports that we have seen, even at first, it always starts with an article in some private media, where the articles are deliberately written using very harsh terminology. As you mentioned, totalitarian sect, dangerous sect, criminal organization, and so on. That is to say, they need to give the reader the impression, or to evoke a very strong emotion of fear, usually, and the associated disgust towards the organization just by looking at it. I really liked how in this video, Cholakian discusses specific schemes of intelligence work, where, for instance, he called one of these schemes a white thread sewn into black cloth. What does that mean? This means that when they need to dehumanize an organization, they usually put in the same article with some other, perhaps already publicly known organization where something bad happened. And they actually sort of stitch through that white thread like on a black canvas. That is, when one looks from afar, one sees a gray canvas. That is, it blends in and he automatically associates, say, Alatra with some criminal organization that he already knows. I think in the very beginning, they even associated Alatra with ISIS or something like that. And that means that one has to come closer and dig deeper into the issue,
Break it down.
and break it down to distinguish that it's actually a white thread sewn into black canvas. This is a handwriting of the intelligence agencies. Another thing that's used, another technique that Cholakian described, is the so-called false victim method. That is, it's usually done in collaboration with renegades from some organization. And so in the case of Alatra, it was a particular former member who, you might say, didn't find what she was looking for, didn't find the fulfillment of her ambitions within the Alatra International Public Movement. And now, she's actually getting what she actually wanted. Right, that is the spotlight,
A lot of attention.
the fame, the attention, the recognition, the applause, and etc. And that it actually creates this fake victim that doesn't even exist in reality.
Okay, but let's go step by step so we don't get confused. Because the chronology is basically clear. But notice that first, and this wasn't that long ago, I think it was sometime in the spring of 2023, there was this sort of a general article with a religionist on a reputable Slovakian portal. As it wasn't explicitly harshly critical, there were critical parts, but it was so intertwined that it was both yes and no. And that's how it was concluded there. Then there was a blog that came out on the next one after that, where they already started to feed in some information regarding the fact that Slovak intelligence agencies were involved in this and so on. And yet, that information was never confirmed anywhere, and it was only two journalists talking on a blog.
SME, we can say that.
Yes, it was on SME. And then there was silence for a long time, until, in a way, events in Ukraine happened in terms of starting that power phase. That is to say, the power phase started there, already specifically the persecutions, house searches, etc. And then at that moment, journalists in Slovakia started to actively denigrate Alatra.
Who took that on?
Yes, but the consistency is exactly like this. There is already this step here, and now, in the next country, we start with this step, and we go on.
You can see that it is organized,
Yes,
and that it is one director.
it actually started, but what struck me is that it wasn't even Slovak journalists, but the journalists from the Czech Republic, right? I mean specifically Mrs. Cyrokova, who, up to that point, like in her career, hadn't dealt with sects and so on at all. Suddenly, she turned around, reoriented herself, and just before she started to be active in this field, she started to deal with sects.
Which is also the evidence that it's actually,
Well, it was mentioned by Cholakian in the video that actually this pattern is going on, that suddenly the journalist in question is completely refocused on a completely different topic that he hasn't studied in his life, hasn't done any reporting on, and so on.
And what I would also like to say is that another one of those steps that is actually being taken, that is, after these defamatory articles come out, I think it was on the 27th of February that we were approached by an editor of a public television asking us for an interview, that they're going to do a news report. On the 1st of March, 3 days after that, most of the official channels of *Allatra and Creative Society were deleted from the TikTok platform, which means that obviously it was in somebody's interest not to allow people to get to the information directly, but to refer to them to these very disparaging, defamatory articles, which were already going to be transferred from the local or some private platforms to the public television platform at the next stage.
Okay, but there was an event that preceded that. In December, a Czech journalist, Cyrokova, came to interview specifically the participants who are in Slovakia. I would be interested to know how she actually found out where the participants were, because in reality, only the state institutions in Slovakia have that information. That's like someone coming to your house to ask you questions, but how did they find out where you live? That's not public information. So here you can see that they also have links to certain other institutions where they get their information.
Yes, it is actually not at all a common thing for a journalist or a reporter from another country to come and try to find out information about people somewhere else. This is very strange. And if we're playing investigative journalist here, it would seem to me the logical thing to do would be to go back to where it all started. Why didn't Mrs. Sarakova or somebody who came from a foreign country to work here to find out information, why didn't they go to the Chelyabinsk region to find out, right? To the town of Plast, where the first trial took place with our participant, which so far, as yet, is completely clarified. There are 1,000 question marks over it. Why? We skipped something in that investigative journalism.
And they all referred to the Chelyabinsk region. So not only in Russia, but they didn't even go to the trouble of denigrating *Allatra. They also referred to it in Ukraine, to the Russian Orthodox Church. The BBC article also refers to the Chelyabinsk region in the conclusion, which we may come to, but this is very interesting. Take the fact that BBC, a medium in the UK, that has been actively supporting Ukraine during the war, so it refers to the Russian Orthodox Church. That simply doesn't bother anybody. There's such subtle nuances that when one approaches that black canvas, one begins to distinguish exactly between that white thread and that black canvas.
And then there was an article. The reporter was focusing on some climatic events, that he was an expert in this area. And now suddenly, the Chelyabinsk region. It was very, very suspicious.
This is exactly the style in which actually defamatory articles are written and defamatory news reports are made. That they create some kind of untrue, false image about some organization or about some topic. For example, the fact is that no one has been convicted in Ukraine yet. There has not been a trial yet. But the Czech journalist, and also one could say Slovak journalists, and are talking about it as if it were a done deal. That simply *Allatra is a criminal organization, and I do not know what. So they're violating the basic rules and the presumption of innocence.
Okay, so let's summarize. In December, Cyrokova comes to do a news report. A news report that is obviously manipulatively edited comes out. There are various insertions that are given as a fact, and yet When we look at some of those statements by other government officials in Ukraine, and in fact, they only mentioned what is happening. It wasn't at all, yes, that it's already been decided that way. But she presented it as a fact. Then we were contacted, just as you said, by the state television asking for an interview with the coordinators of the Creative Society in Slovakia and, of course, Alatra alongside that. And then, as this request came in, to which we said, okay, we'd be happy to meet and to explain some of the information and questions that you may have, then subsequently to that, the TikTok accounts were deleted so that the information could not be given out amongst the people. After the editor of RTVS came to do a news report where there was such a confrontational exchange of opinions, where we explicitly asked her on what basis she was going to do a news report with us, since no one had confirmed it so far. And most importantly, what we were interested in, because in the meantime it turned out that she had said that she wanted to do a news report with us and with the coordination center or somewhere that is in Bratislava, and it turned out that she had been trying to break into homes in eastern Slovakia where refugees or people who had been granted asylum or protection from the war in Ukraine by the Slovak Republic live. What was she doing there? On what basis? Why did she go there? When we confronted her with this, it resulted in her being very taken aback with the fact, where did we get this information from? And her reaction revealed that she had been given the exact information about where to go and where to try to get additional footage. Having said that, she had shot footage of the housing of one, of the other, showed it in the news report, which in fact is also a violation of journalistic ethics, etc. How can she just come in and say, here lives this and that person? He's not a public official, he's no one special, he is a person who uses the protection of the Slovak Republic just like any other citizen. And the second thing is, right after the report, when it was filmed, there was a period of 2 weeks in which another news report was published completely outside the RTVS coverage, under the lamp, where coincidentally Mrs. Tsirokova was invited as a guest.
That was Dinner with Havran.
Ah, yes, Dinner with Havran, exactly, I'm sorry. And that's why Mrs. Tsirokova was invited there, and the whole news report was conducted in the way that they were there, they were talking about two more like sects or something, but the whole thing was conducted in the way that, as you mentioned, that you'll put one organization that we know is a sect, another one that we know is a sect, and then you'll insert Alatra in between, so that the viewer gets the impression that it's also a sect. They also invited a representative there, a church representative. I'm just wondering if the gentleman in question realized that he was actually defending the interests of the Russian Orthodox Church.
Right. What else should be mentioned is that all these reports have one common handwriting, which is proof that they still showed the same experts.
Yes, each other.
Still the same experts. When the first report came out in Slovakia, it referred to Mrs. Sidorkova to Mr. Wojtyszek, who referred indirectly to the aforementioned Dvorkin.
Dvorkin?
Exactly. Because he's a follower of Dvorkin's, who's his mentor of some sort. And what I would like to say is, what I found quite interesting, and we'll get to that later today, public television invite representatives of private media. Reporters from private media who, you could say, in the past, have not done the kind of work they're commenting on this report.
Yes.
If we take, for example, the security analyst, Mr. Brannick, who is a blogger for this daily newspaper, SME, and contributes to Tishtan.sk, and he comments on some security threat from Alatra.
I'm wondering whether he worked in the security services or intelligence organizations at all.
Well, that is... And then we have an ethnologist who happens to be political candidate of Progressive Slovakia Party. And then, of course, there's Mrs. Sirkova, who has been subject for several reports in the Czech Republic because of prejudice and biased information. So it then comes down to the question of whose interests the public television is pursuing and what objectives it is pursuing. And we will come to that.
And I'll add that actually after the TV show with Havran, Sirokova is again releasing a report where she actually denigrates Alatra in Ukraine. And it can be said that on the basis of her report, the representative of the Ukrainian Verkhovna Rada, the deputy who initiated the whole thing, is immediately making a statement saying that there is still no decision, no trial, nothing, that it is still only at the stage of investigation, as if she were already eager, indicating that it needs to wrap up already, because we need a trial.
So, the politician is pushing
The investigators and the law enforcement agencies to basically already deliver the verdict that they need.
Right. That would be the next step in here as well.
And that would be the next step for sure.
After the news report on public television, which we could perhaps dwell on a little more, what was interesting and what shows the bias and one-sidedness of this report is that Mrs. Penchatova, the editor, filmed us for 2 hours of material, and yet only exactly 1 minute and 42 seconds was used. Each one of those, you could say, clippings that she used lasted an average of 3 to some 7 seconds and was inserted between two negative statements by these different analysts.
Yes.
Who, from my point of view, are not interested in making sense of it, what Alatra is about. But they've been given a clear order to classify Alatra movement as a cult and dangerous and so on, and to smear the name and create public opinion that is a dangerous organization, that is a security threat, and I don't know what else. What was also very interesting is the fact that this whole report was based on the false claims that Alatra was being investigated by the Slovak police throughout the whole report. The phrase that the Slovak police had been alerted to the movement was used several times. What I would like to say is that nobody said that this was actually an article by Mr. Pukovsky, who managed the Facebook pages Fraud and Hoaxes. It was never some sort of, you could say, official statement from the police. No one from the police has contacted us officially yet, nor has anyone been contacted, let alone the police have had any dealings with us or investigating anything. So again, an attempt to feed the public false information about some kind of security threat, which in principle goes exactly according to the handwriting that took place both in Russia and in Ukraine, and which, as we will go on to discuss, is directed towards the other objectives of this organization.
And one of the goals is basically, again, camouflage. It was mentioned in the RTVS news report how much money has been paid to refugees who are actually tried for terrorism in Ukraine and are hiding here. However, the fact that this money was paid by the Slovak government to Slovak citizens who are providing them with accommodation was not mentioned.
That's the case with all refugees, actually.
Exactly. It is just the way the program works, that Slovak citizens who provide accommodation for those who have left Ukraine receive a contribution from the Slovak government. The amount was voiced. It was a big, huge amount. But what struck me was that it gives the impression, and now we will show the parallel, it gives the impression that the Slovak government supports, and it is the bad one, and is funding, allegedly, a criminal organization. And notice what followed on RTVS after the part of the report about Alatra was over. Immediately they showed that a man had died in the hospital, whom nobody had noticed in the corridor there. Another narrative that shows the state of the Slovak healthcare, the inability of the Slovak government and Slovak ministries to take care of its citizens. So this is another narrative that ultimately they are climbing on the back of Alatra to the point to be able to attack the Slovak government, which, by the way, was elected by the citizens of the Slovak Republic in a free election. I mean, they are our representatives. And by what right does anybody allow themselves, quasi-Slovak state television, to post and attack the Slovak government?
We'll get to that.
We'll get to that. But it's exactly this narrative, and it fits exactly the work of the KGB, as does the terminology used by reporters, both in Russia and in Ukraine, and suddenly also in Slovakia. These are exactly the same questions. You could say only translated into Slovak, and the same questions are being asked. There it is being asked, here it is being asked, there you ask it, and it was still the same answer. So then, what kind of investigative journalist are you? I'll tell you about one more such story that I had with an acquaintance who went to work for the United Nations in New York, who said that journalists no longer. In fact, he refuses to speak to journalists, and the reason that he gave was that reporters as such have ceased to exist. Even in schools, they are not taught to become reporters, but to become, he called it, novelists, or Pavel Dobshinsky's storytellers, where they are given a story and the result that the story is supposed to achieve, and then they subcontextualize that story so that it leads to what they need. So there's another fact of reporters not doing their job the way they are supposed to.
Exactly. And they're paid agents who spread disinformation and create public opinion, so that people themselves are then set against each other, so that ultimately the people themselves are the initiators of, say, some riots or the overthrow of the government, and so on.
Because that information can be conveyed in 1,000 different ways, whether about those posts you were talking about or about that man in that hospital. But those reporters, when they use that kind of framing of a certain topic, of their agenda, it may not be immediately apparent to a normal person. But when he sees it, this scheme on one, on the second, on the third, on the fourth case, and he sees where it's all going, it's not going in a good direction at all.
And people don't actually realize it at all. A lot of people may say to themselves, what do I care about Latra? At least there will be one less organization. But people don't realize what the next steps are. That we can realistically get into the situation that Ukraine is in today. That there may be civil war that may actually result in riots and fratricide. Because what is the aim? The aim is to absolutely polarize society. For example, look at how people behave towards each other today. For example, who are in favor of those political parties which have a pro-Western narrative, and those which they accuse of having a pro-Russian narrative. After all, people do not talk to each other. There are conflicts within families, between colleagues. Every time they get on this wave, on this policy issue, there is an absolute clash of interests, and they can be almost violent, you could say.
Now take this. After all, we are Slovaks. We should first and foremost defend the interests of the Slovak Republic,
And we defend them.
and not the left or the right. Residents and our fellow citizens should realize that we are first and foremost citizens of the Slovak Republic, and we have to defend the interests of Slovakia. And let me tell you, I think it will be very difficult for the Slovak government to identify and cleanse the media space and other sort of parts of the structure, whether it is the state administration, etc., from those agents who are involved in this intelligence network.
Exactly. Because if you take even just a live article on the Facebook page of the police hoaxes, we have warned. We have sent an official letter to the police asking them to take it down. And so far, absolutely no response, which proves that there are still KGB agents in the ranks of police working on some plan of their own. And with that, perhaps it would be a good idea to appeal to the Ministry of Interior of Slovak Republic to shine a light on its ranks, that is, who they are playing for.
Yes, it's quite obvious to us because the administrator of that Facebook page is already doing something completely different. In my opinion, the Minister of the Interior spoke quite strongly when he disagreed with what was going on that Facebook page. And yet, that Facebook page is still there.
It still exists for some reason. And what else I would like to comment on? Consider that, in fact, these media that we have mentioned, one could say the very same journalists, what they do, what articles they write, and what tendencies they provoke in masses. For example, after the elections that were held in Slovakia, whether they were parliamentary elections or presidential elections. In the parliamentary elections, SMER won with a democratic majority and formed a government. Similarly, in the presidential elections, Pellegrini won by a democratic majority and will be Slovakia's president. What news is being spread by these media? And not only by the private media. That is a whole another story. After all, the representative of Fico said that he would not answer questions from certain newspapers, such as Denik A, SME, and I don't know what else, which are exactly the same media outlets that provoke negative opinions in people about Allatra. And it's already even in the public institution, the Slovak television. I think even the Fico mentioned something there about the need to clean it up. And I'm not surprised at all. After all, they're doing sabotage practically. They're actually bringing in representatives or reporters from private media and presenting anti-state activities there.
Yes, but consider this. They are using Allatra to be the Trojan horse of their anti-state activities. So here, they're dragging you in and using the same format and narrative to begin to create exactly the same ground in Slovakia to do the same actions and practices that they did both in the Russian Federation and in Ukraine. And I'd like to add one more thing here. I found that in all of these reports, there is the exact same message, that the government is the bad one, the government is the one that doesn't act, and that goes back to exactly what Egon Cholakian said in his videos, that people will start demanding, or they will start just asking for the government to change because it's not acting and so on. But it was a free election, so in the next election you can express another opinion. But at the moment we have this government, and that's basically unchangeable.
Exactly. But consider this. The same narrative that they use against Alatra, that we're like a pro-Russian sect, the same narrative is actually used against the prime minister and the whole government. That is being labeled as a pro-Russian just because they want a peaceful solution. They want the conflict situation to be resolved at the negotiating table. Also within Alatra and the creative society, we talk about the need for peace, the need for an end to all wars, and we're also labeled as actually a pro-Russian sect. So it is exactly the same narrative that is being used by these paid actors, these KGB agents, to subvert society and to create totalitarianism.
I have one more piece of information here. As Prime Minister Fico said that it will be necessary to quickly resolve the illegal political activities of RTVS, and especially the illegal political operation of RTVS. That is to say, they were actually preparing an operation and they wanted to create, if not completely overthrow the government, or to create a situation where there would be unrest. That is, in this way, they are inciting violations of constitutionality, violations of the law, so that they can then apply this same model in other European democratic countries.
Exactly. So Slovakia is a bridge,
Yes.
for KGB to operate in Europe and in the democratic, Western democratic world.
I will add one more thing to what I said. This division of society, there are now organizations that study that level of cohesion among citizens. That is, when the cohesion is highest, it's basically like a creative period. People are in a positive mood, they are working together, they're cooperating, that state and that country is actually progressing. And then, when it's at its lowest, that's when society is completely polarized, divided. And according to their information, we are already at such a low stage that precedes revolutions or civil wars. So my question is, what is being prepared here? It just doesn't happen by chance. I was talking to an acquaintance yesterday who was saying that it has gotten to such absurdities that kids lock up their parents so they can't go to vote.
Just take what they were doing in the school as well, how they were simply brainwashing young people with false information. What I liked the most was when they associated some stupid person with a Fico voter. That this image was created in society by using these special techniques of intelligence agencies to instill a certain idea into the consciousness of people, who then do not even think about whether it is true or not.
One draws a quick conclusion, and that's it. And he has no idea that his conclusion has been prepared in advance.
So we, in other words, we citizens, should not all just ignore it. When we see that something illegal, unconstitutional is happening and we should do it, even though a lot of people will say, well, there's no point in that. No. We should always turn to the police, to law enforcement, or simply to representatives in the government, representatives in parliaments or regional councils, and ask them what is being done about this issue. Whether I have been wrongly accused, whether I have been unfairly slandered, or whether such and such articles have been published about me that do not correspond to the truth. So we as citizens should really not only just pay attention to this, but we should consistently go after it when something like this happens, because only we can thus ensure that there is no free scope for certain operations
Which are consistently breaking the law.
that are consistently breaking the law.
Even just the presumption of innocence. After all, We should be the ones who should be interested in drawing consequences against those who violate the presumption of innocence, because they're acting illegally.
One more interesting fact to our discussion that was voiced in Egon Cholakian's video, in which he actually said that in Slovak universities are recruited foreign intelligence agents, and we found out who he was actually talking about. I mean, I looked it up, and it's even publicly available there. Dworkin was given a doctor honoris causa at the University of Prešov. That is, Dworkin, who is a hardline anti-cult figure and who considers Johannes Agard his mentor in this area, who in turn also has very hardline anti-cult rhetoric as well. Dworkin literally admires him, and Agard is the one who declared the First Amendment in the American Constitution to be a First Amendment neurosis. He'd probably most likely to repel it.
This Agard is also referred to by Mr. Vajicek, a religionist in the Czech Republic, whom we have been talking about.
Now, wait a minute, I'll look in these notes of mine what I have found.
The connection.
It's remarkably well connected.
That is, Dworkin, as we already know, is a person directly subordinate with the hidden KGB controller, which means that in addition to that, Dworkin's organization, Rasirs, which is actually an offshoot of Fekris, the Russian offshoot of Fekris, is thus connected to the Moscow Patriarch Kirill. And now, his right-hand man, Dworkin's man, is actually Alexander Novopashin, who is known for his strong anti-Ukrainian narratives in which he calls Ukrainians cannibals and so on. We come to this stage at the end, and at the beginning, the reporter Sirokova, who claims to be advocating pro-European values and so on, is referring to them indirectly by that, or simply drawing on them. And one more interesting thing we found, that Novopashin was awarded the Order of Friendship in 2023 by Sergei Kirienko on behalf of Vladimir Putin himself. This means that Kirienko, who is now the first deputy head of the presidential administration of the Russian Federation, has direct links to people who are either directly controlled or even involved in the KGB network. And in the Russian Federation, Kirienko often takes decisions of national importance and nature on his own behalf. That is, without asking anybody for anything, he just assigns, I don't know, such and such an organization this, assigns this to that organization. That means that we now also understand that behind state leaders and around them there are people who can feed them certain narratives without those politicians knowing it.
That is, who actually has a power in that state.
Yes. That is, in fact, even here, not all journalists are necessarily involved. Some may even do this unknowingly because they think that they are following a certain lead or narrative, but they do not understand at all what they are following. They just blindly take it and give it, without analyzing it and doing it. And that fits with what I told you about what my friend said, that journalists and reporters are extinct, that they just don't exist anymore.
Although there are certainly still some honest journalists, And we have also labeled many journalists here as KGB agents. But it has to be said that definitely not all of them are. Because we know how it works, that today, in order to keep a place, or to be still in, a journalist looks out for the most up-to-date news. And it is enough that one is paid to leak this information, and the others automatically take it over. So nothing is black and white. We have also commented here about the fits of voters. So, on the other hand, in order to remain objective, it must be said that there are also those who are labeled as snowflakes. But all this actually, what does it prove? What it proves is, as such, you could say, emotional terms are used to polarize society, to make people hate each other.
It's just not that transparent. You can't see it at a first glance. But we do have our leaders, those who are obviously tarnishing it. Or just even those who just take and copy some articles without verifying it. They are basically playing into the hands of that KGB organization, like there's nothing to discuss. But as Cholakian was saying, basically, there has to be an investigation, and we are relying on the authorities there, and gradually, it will be uncovered. Gradually, they will all be uncovered.
And we know that the investigation is ongoing. I myself am looking forward to the outcome. Even if it's, I don't know, in a year, in 2 years, I'm curious actually to see what it will be achieved.
Well, yeah, but most importantly, that's exactly how agent recruitment works in the intelligence world. It is never done directly. It never happens like, come work for us. It's always done so covertly that even the person who has been recruited often doesn't even know about it. And only when the task for which he was recruited occurs, then he suddenly finds out that he's already in that network, simply that he's already stuck there. And that's exactly, this system works to keep, let's say, journalists like Tsirokova, Benchatova, some religionists, who are connected to somebody stuck in their network. And the moment when they are needed to fulfill the task required of them, they are already recruited and can no longer back down.
Well, why can't they back down?
You know what, I'll tell you, one Czech spy who deserted, he described it perfectly in his memoirs. That just like that, somebody comes to you and asks you for a favor or asks you for something to write because, I don't know, there's a situation and it's in your, setting, right? So you are like, yeah, sure, great, no problem, I'll help, I'll fix it.
And that's their job, right?
And of course, either you do it that way, or on the other hand, they will pay you for it. Like, oh great, we'll pay you for it because we need to get the article out and so on. And there's even an invoice, there's already an order and everything. And subsequently, there will be a couple of those, and then he says, and all of a sudden the same person comes up and says, well, tell me the length of the runway at the military airport in Kuchyňa. Tell me how many, I don't know, Patriot devices are located there and there. And I can't get that for you, you know, that's classified information. Well, excuse me, we have evidence here that you've been working with us for a year. And now make up your mind. Either you keep supplying us with information, or you do what we ask you to do, or we just send this to law enforcement and you end up in jail. And they've already got a man recruited and most people have nowhere to turn back. So this has been described in more than one paper about the way agents are recruited nowadays.
And today, there is nowhere to go because they operate in many countries.
So the battlefield where it takes place in our minds requires a very thorough analysis of what is presented, suggested to you, and so on. Just think about it. More people have suffered from the activities of these anti-cult organizations than in the First and Second World Wars combined. And they have directly or indirectly caused death of more people than the sects they sort of condemn, and alternative religions, for example, which they label as sect. So, there's something fundamentally wrong here. Yet, take Alatra, for example. We're just ordinary volunteers, people who have our own jobs, people who do this explicitly because we care about the problem that is looming with the climate. Other media outlets are gradually starting to highlight it as well. But basically, we don't do anything else. And look at how our individual participants suffer. And due to the work of such journalists as Tsirokova, Benchatova, for example, where our participant in Ukraine also had journalists come to him, they showed his house, and subsequently, after the war started, missiles flew in and destroyed the house. After all, the volunteer did not live in this house alone, but with his family, children, small grandchildren, and all of them saved themselves only by a miracle. Naturally, after this event, the family had to leave Ukraine, and this volunteer, who suffered 2 contusions in the explosion of his home, was discharged from the army and later peacefully left with his family. He legally crossed the borders of Slovakia because part of the family already lived here. He arrived in Slovakia as a refugee. Here they show his house from all sides. For what purpose? Are we now to expect someone to come and burn his house down? Or someone to come and kidnap him, or something like that? For what purpose? This is where they are sort of getting into the position non-journalistic, and a mistake has slipped in. Somehow we have misinterpreted the information, but literally into the position of endangering the national security of the Slovak Republic and the safety of citizens and people who live in this territory. They are directly involved in marking the targets, so she went there with a clear purpose to show and mark the house. And it was evident in her demeanor when she came here and we asked her about it. She lost her speech and became nervous when we precisely questioned her about it. So she had a clear task to accomplish there.
I mean, basically, reporters in these reports show the object
They show the target.
and thus making the target of the attack.
I also found another piece of information which is very interesting and very important to mention, that FECRIS, in its training of journalists, said that they should infiltrate among the participants of the sects and show their homes, show where they live. So you see, this is exactly the instruction on how you're supposed to function as a guiding agent for something like this to happen.
Unbelievable.
That's shocking. After all, there are plenty of other cases as well where they damage the property of the participants after such news reports. Precisely after these news reports, they spray banners people had up there and things like that. Not to mention the wave that has been launched against the participants as far as, say, their private lives are concerned. How many were fired from their jobs? How many got trouble at work? You mentioned a case of the doctor in the Czech Republic.
Can you imagine, in the main article of the Seznam Zprávy, a respected doctor was smeared for supporting the Creative Society. Just some photos, I don't know. Somehow they blurred it there. Smeared her reputation, the whole polyclinic. And for what? For what? As you say, we are ordinary people who want to raise awareness of a problem that is a problem of all of us, who can't see that the climate is changing. And for this, we are going to be chased? It doesn't make sense.
Exactly. Another one of our participants, which is very interesting, a participant who has also spoken at conferences. He comes from Bucha, which was bombed. He himself was holding his son, and for several days, they had to hide in shelters. He made a video about it as well, how he and his wife were thinking about who was going to go to the store to buy water because they didn't have anything to drink anymore. And they were saying goodbye because they didn't know if they were actually going to come back from that store at all because it was a few blocks away. And this man actually fled. He's in Slovakia at the moment as well. He's an expert. He was in high position in the field of education and so forth. And here, of course, he wanted to integrate into society. He wanted to find a job. He got kicked out of two. One was a high school, and the other one was also a school. And why did they fire him? Just because he supported creative society. And what's more, they told him he either leaves Allatra or they will have to say goodbye to him.
So in other words, they're firing him for pro-Russian, as they defined it, views. Well, this is a man who suffered and feared for his life in Bucha,
He was under direct bombardment.
under direct bombardment.
So you can see here, if one looks a little bit closely at this, how there's inconsistencies and often even contradictory information.
And they're just pursuing their goal, and they don't care that the information that they are using to achieve this goal is contradictory, divergent, they contradict each other. It doesn't matter. As long as they put it out there, this is our goal and we want to achieve it.
Exactly. These are not isolated cases. There's also the participant who used to work, or still works, in a kindergarten, and she had to go on a sick leave because she was threatened with being fired. Because the parents of the children themselves, after seeing the news reports, wrote to the management of the school to ask how a cultist was allowed to work in their establishment and educate their children.
That's that presumption of innocence.
So what are these journalists actually doing in society? What kind of sentiments are they stirring up, right? And I may digress a bit, but take the fact that now there was, I think it was young Kaliniak, who almost had a fight with somebody there just because he simply represents a political party. Also, on the other hand, if, say, somebody knows that they voted for somebody, what should they expect now that they're going to get beaten up in the street? What kind of sentiment actually?
Exactly, and in the same way with Shimechka, for instance.
Absolutely.
The same thing, that they just see him somewhere and they are already ranting and raving.
Exactly.
That is to say, these sentiments that, and yet people are completely unaware that these sentiments are deliberately being created to divide us into two camps.
Exactly. And yet politicians themselves from both sides of the political spectrum, the current president, the current prime minister, the next president, they're all calling on people to calm down because they know what the prevailing mood in society is at the moment.
It seems strange to them too, right? You basically have two groups vying to run the state. Nothing more. Each promising the people that they will be better off. And they're not competing with each other as hard as we're being fed in that media.
And then the organization that, I'll say it again, the Allatra International Public Movement and the Creative Society, which is only drawing attention to what is happening with the climate. And today, only a blind person can't see what's going on with the climate when you look at what's been happening around the world in the last weeks, months. So an organization that draws attention to that, volunteers who are normally living a standard life, who are patriots to their country, who have families,
Don't break their laws.
who don't break laws, right? They proclaim that we should live in peace. They're subjected to this kind of pillaring. And then, where does it go from there?
The KGB's 200 million seems to have been very well invested in cyber warfare.
Absolutely.
But we can see that it is functional.
Yes, it's really important for people to notice what's going on and try to analytically break it down. Look at the video that came out with Egon Cholakian, which shows exactly the model and the sequence. Feel free to send it to your elected representatives so they too can watch the video and see what is going on there. That way they will also see the parallel that is happening here and in other countries. because only in this way we can prevent them from succeeding in their aim and in their revenge, which ultimately will not have very good consequences for us.
And we could perhaps also talk about the last stage that is happening now. And that is a persecution that is currently taking place against some participants in the Alatra project. And it is important to understand that all this persecution is only happening because most people are silent. Silence is absolutely the biggest problem we have in society today. In this context, I can also think of a saying. It goes as follows. When they were taking socialists, I was silent because I was not a socialist. When they took the trade unionists, I was also silent because I was not a trade unionist. And when they took the Jews, I also kept quiet because I was not a Jew. And when they took me, there was no one to stand up for me. And that's exactly what we see in society today. All this is happening just because we're silent.
We should not be silent, because this is exactly our responsibility. No one else will defend it. We cannot rely on any authorities to do it on their own. Because look, we have been silent so far, and where we have got to, it is really up to us, up to you, up to Robert, up to me, up to us, the people. Whenever we see democracy being trampled on somewhere, to say so, to put a stop to it. The same thing, the presumption of innocence, when somebody is labeled without any facts.
Without any trial.
Without any trial, yes, exactly. It's up to us to just step in and say no. Not this, it's just not possible. Basically, when the whole nation stands up like that, it's not possible to go through with it.
Exactly. And that is what we're doing now. Just think about it. The government has been democratically elected. The media has been throwing dirt on it in order to destroy it. And what we're doing now is that, thanks to Egon Cholakian, and thanks to this program that we're filming, these practices are being exposed and we're speaking out. We're not being silent. We're speaking out, saying who's doing it, why they're doing it, and so on. The government of the Slovak Republic has my absolute confidence because they're experienced politicians. I really like the fact that they say that they're pro-Slovak, that they're not defending someone else's interests, whether from one side or the other. That said, it would be good if people simply followed example and did not remain silent.
Yes, it is only necessary to stop ourselves because we have got used to the idea that it is normal to throw dirt. It is probably best seen in those politicians. This one does this, that one does that. Some cause is brought up and dirt is thrown. We see it all the time, and we don't stop it either because we've gotten used to it. We take it to be normal. But this is not normal. Actually, when we have a state, when we have our representatives, we've elected them, so we go hand in hand with them.
We can ask them to explain some actions that they have done, but basically we are in the same boat with them. It is our country, and therefore we should support them as citizens of the Slovak Republic in this. And of course, demand that they defend the interests of the Slovak Republic.
Indeed.
And therefore, we as citizens of the Slovak Republic can support them. And we must support them, because they are our elected representatives.
Exactly. And it is, as you said, important to restore the understanding of the presumption of innocence. And to speak up when we see in the media that dirt is being thrown, that somebody is accusing somebody of something that, let's say, hasn't been decided by the court of law. It hasn't been. It has no basis, right? It's made of nothing. Speak up. Well, if people speak up, and law enforcement stays silent, that means they're in on it too, you know?
Or they are not in their right place.
Or they're not in the right place.
Slovakia was supposed to be a stepping stone in this operation to destroy democracies in other countries and in the United States and the European Union. Let us make it a stepping stone to preserve democracy and to preserve the setup that we have. And let us not allow the KGB to break up this grouping. It is up to us. It is up to nobody else.
Here, we must still realize that there's no hiding now. Now, Egon Cholakian and his group have been working for more than 30 years to uncover this whole, so to speak, Hydra. And today, nobody can make excuses that they didn't know about something. And as Cholakian said in the video, high treason, it has no statute of limitations. This means that all those who were involved will be punished. And this is all the information that we've been trying to bring to you, the people, over the last 10 plus years, for which we have been labeled as cultists, for which you have also been spitting in our faces and in our backs. But we have endured it because we knew what was going on and we needed. We felt it necessary to draw attention to this, because if we had stopped, you would have had a very big problem too.
It's necessary to realize that it is volunteers from all over the world who are gathering this information, which is then put into videos that are then available on our channels. Because there is currently no other summary of what is happening around the planet. No media, no newspaper, no news portal, no television can give you such a complete picture. So basically, if we wrap it up, who's going to do it? Where are you going to get that information from?
Precisely. And all the members, or one could say volunteers, of both the undeclared International Public Movement and the Creative Society are the people who are patriots, who absolutely respect the principles of democracy. Democracy, the word, this word has been used here many times today. But we say it in its true meaning. That is, demos kratos. And that is the rule of people, and not of some elites or organizations. And we fully respect religious freedom. We fully respect freedom of opinion. And it's up to you. You have the information of how it is. And you have the information from the corrupt journalists and draw your own conclusions.
We knew what we were suffering for freedom and democracy. If we threw the undeclared flag down, there would be no one left to raise it. And there would be no one to bring you information.
We would like to thank Egon Cholakian for exposing these KGB practices aimed at breaking up the United States, the European Union, and Russia, and the overall democratic system we have today. Dear Slovaks, please realize that the kind of society we live in is not the fault of one political party or the other. But there are third forces at work here. Third forces that are the legislators of the New World Order.
And yet we have one far worse enemy, and that is climate change. Let's consider, in just 10 days in April, temperature records were broken in 180 countries. Storms, gales, hailstorms, tornadoes began to appear even in the areas of the planet where such phenomena were rare or never observed at all. On March 31st in China, one strong gust of wind blew out the floor-to-ceiling windows of a multi-story building. The wind gust was so strong that it carried 3 people directly through the broken windows on the 20th and the 11th floors while they slept. Since March 31st, 2 days of torrential rain in western France have caused the worst flooding on record. The storms in China's Jiangxi province were unprecedented. Since March 29th, in arid Saudi Arabia, the rains have not stopped for a week. The spring floods of 2024 in Russia have become a real catastrophe. 39 regions have already been affected. The Orenburg region has never experienced such a flood in the entire history of observations. In Kazakhstan, 12 of the country's 17 regions were affected by floods. This is the biggest flooding in the country in 80 years. The number and strength of earthquakes have increased. One of them is the magnitude 7.2 earthquake that hit Taiwan on April 3rd. This earthquake was the strongest on the island in 25 years. Also untypical for the US state of New Jersey, the magnitude 4.8 earthquake was felt in the major metropolitan areas of New York and Washington, D.C. The quake was one of the largest seismic events on the country's east coast in the past 100 years. In just one day from April 3rd to the 4th, a record number of earthquakes with magnitudes over 5 on the Richter scale were recorded on the planet.
And these are the facts.
And these are the facts. These are facts you can verify. Therefore, we would like to urge all those who follow us to prepare or look at how to prepare for similar climate disasters and changes, because most people die precisely because they do not know what to do, are not informed, and are not prepared for how to behave in a given situation.
You have heard what has happened in the last few days, and the trend is growing. Start taking an interest in what is happening. Get your emergency backpack ready. Count on the fact that if there is even a small probability of an earthquake somewhere, that earthquake will occur there. When an area is prone to flooding, count on the fact that that flood will come there. The point is that we all need to be prepared for what is coming. The point is basically just to know what is happening and to be prepared for it. It's about making sure that we all survive. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.